Okay, we are on day 45 and we're going to dig into Leviticus chapter 17. Let's go ahead and go into prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you that you helped me today. I thank you that I can breathe, I can see. I thank you that I'm able to walk, that I can talk, that you have surrounded me by women who will pour into me and hold me accountable to your word. I thank you that you are supplying the finances that we need for the roof, the hole in the ceiling, for Antonella Marie's wedding, and Tino's car being fixed. I thank you for providing what you feel that we need. I thank you for the job opportunities. I thank you for always opening doors when one shuts. I thank you for the ability to discern good and evil. And for the ones that I miss, I just pray that you smack me upside the head and keep me from the evil. I am just so grateful for who you are. Now, Father God, I thank you. I thank you for saving my life all those years ago, for opening my eyes to the truth of who I am and who you are, from stopping me from killing myself. I thank you for opening my eyes to the truth. I thank you for taking me out of a coven. I thank you for showing me what it's like to truly know you and to truly love you. I thank you, Jesus, for making it so that I am not held to who I used to be, but I have been reborn and made new in you. And I thank you that you do all this for everybody who's listening. And I pray that if there's anything that they're holding on to from the past, that they feel shame, I just pray that you help them see themselves the way that you now see them, and that you remind them that they have been truly reborn. I pray all this in your son, Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so let's go in and talk a little bit about Leviticus before we read. So Leviticus 17 is going to set the stage for pretty much a lot of things that we hear about in the whole entire rest of the Bible. There's several fundamental foundation concepts that are going to be introduced into Leviticus 17. Now, most of the stuff that we've talked about in Leviticus has been directly geared towards the priest. However, these chapters are addressed to every level of Israelites. So regardless of what stage or status they are, this is for all the Israelites. At the time frame of Leviticus, where we are right now in chapter 17, it's only been maybe a year now since they have left Egypt. Now, Exodus 12:38, we're told that there's a mixed multitude of people that marched along with Israel out of Egypt. So we don't know how many a multitude is, but it means that there's a significant number of people. And that we find that many of God's laws and commands specifically addresses those foreigners who are from Egypt and they have joined Israel. So it's not just the Israelites who have left Egypt and who are walking and going along with them. And Leviticus 17 is going to touch on, and the next few chapters are going to be touching on these foreigners and the rest of Israel and what they need to do. Not all these foreigners became official Israelites. Some had other reasons for throwing in with Moses' mob than merely becoming Israelites. Tom says it probably was a significant portion of them represented intermarriages between the Egyptians and the Israelites. Other people and tribes, including Egyptians, were um, very likely several Semitic, meaning those who came from Noah's son Shem, but non-Hebrew people and tribes who had personally witnessed and survived the awesome wrath and power of God of Israel, decided that they wanted to enjoy the benefits of being part of the Israelites. So remember, you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Those are Noah's three sons. And so a lot of the Shem, probably that tribe. So there's different people throughout the time, and different tribes who are going to join the Israelites, not because they are Israelites themselves, but because they have heard about Jehovah, the one and only living true God, and they want to be on his side. So they're going to join in with the Israelites. Now, this enormous group of refugees in the wilderness consisted of that we need to, okay, hold on, I'm lost. Okay, so this enormous group of refugees in the wilderness consisted of, we need to include a substantial amount of non-Hebrews, foreigners, that were also part of it. So understand that the Egyptians were a massive amount of people, about 3 million. And then you have all these foreigners who are coming in. And some of these foreigners could have been that they intermarried when they were back in Egypt. So we might have some Egyptians going on around here. So this is so cool because we see that God, Jehovah God, grafting people in to the Israel tribe, which is exactly what Jesus Christ, Yeshua, has done for us. We are grafted in when we become redeemed. When Gentiles are redeemed, we are joined to Israel, or more accurately, to Israel's covenants. We don't become Israelites, but we are grafted in at the spiritual level in the same way that we are brought into union with Jesus. Now, you're going to find in the Torah that it is not those foreigners were required to join Israel by giving up all their traditions and customs and adopting Hebrew culture. It was that they had to submit to the Hebrew God and to Israelite authority. They didn't have to say, we were Edomites, but today we fully renounce our heritages and become Jews. So in other words, they came in, and if they were Moabites, they could say, oh, I'm a Moabite, but they would follow and obey the Israel laws. They would join in, and they would have to follow all of everything that Moses is bringing down. There was no tolerance of other cultures brought into the Israelites, but you did not have to renounce who you were. So, for example, I'm Italian. My mother is 100% Italian. When they came to the United States, they learned English. They worked hard. They assimilated into America because they wanted to live in America. They wanted to benefit from America. They loved everything that America gave. So they weren't going to bring in all of the Italian culture. Now, my great-grandparents spoke Italian and my grandparents spoke Italian, but they did not teach my mother Italian. So it kind of stopped. And they kept who they were, but they gave up a lot of things so that they could assimilate into the United States. And that's exactly what Jehovah God is requiring of anyone who is living in with the Israelites. It's a good note to know and to understand. In today's culture, where there's a lot of people who are against borders and assimilating into the United States, Jehovah God expects that from when we become followers of Christ. We are to adapt to his will and not our will. We are to give up everything that we want and desire so that we can be in his things. Now, this concept is a very, very important concept for you. Because if Gentile believers are not grafted into Israel and their covenants with God, then indeed the Torah and the Old Testament is unimportant and irrelevant. But we have been grafted in. We are now part of that covenant. When we look at Romans 11:13, Paul is speaking to the Gentiles, and Paul is saying that we are grafted into Israel and Israel's covenants. So being part of Israel is by definition being part of their covenants. We are reading in the Torah has much significance for any and all who profess to be disciples of the Messiah, Yeshua, of Jesus Christ. We are not required to become radical or physical or national or religious Jews, but we are required to live within the terms of their covenant, for only within their covenant exists the basis for the atonement that Christ offers to all who trust in him. So Tom Bradford really wants us to understand the significance of being grafted into this covenant and what that means. Now we're going to go ahead and read Leviticus chapter 17. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron, to his sons, and to all the children of Israel, and say to them, This is the thing which the Lord has commanded, saying, Whatever man of the house of Israel who kills an ox or a lamb or a goat or in a camp, or who kills it outside the camp and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of meeting and offer an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, the guilt of the bloodshed shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people, to the end that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices which they offer in the open field, that they may bring them to the Lord all the door of the tabernacle of meeting to the priest, and offer them as a peace offering to the Lord. And the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and burn the fat for a sweet aroma to the Lord. They shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons, after whom they have played the harlot. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout the generations. Also, you shall say to them, Whatever man or the house of Israel or of the strangers who dwell among them, who offer burnt offerings or sacrifices, and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from among his people. And whatever man of the house of Israel or of the strangers who dwell among you, who eats any blood, I will set my face. That's Jehovah's face against that person who eats blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, No one among you shall eat blood, nor shall any strangers who dwell among you eat blood. Whatever man of the children of Israel or of the strangers who dwell among you, who hunts and catches any animal or bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with dust. For it is the life of all flesh. Its blood sustains its life. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, You shall not eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is in its blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off. And every person who eats what died naturally, or what was torn by beast, whether he is a native of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Then he shall be clean. But if he does not wash them or bathe them his body, then he shall bear his guilt. All right, so let's explain a little bit of this. Now, when we look at verse 2, this is addressed to all of Israel, every level of Israel's society. In verse 3, we get this foundational instruction. No domestic living creature, animals, are to be ritually slaughtered outside of the tabernacle, not wild animals. So, in other words, the rule is about the domestic animals and not the wild animals. And if you notice, the animals mentioned are the clean animals, the ones that may be used for both the sacrifice and for food. So essentially, all the domestic animals that will be used as a meat source must first be offered as a sacrifice. And then once they get into the promised land, that changes. Now, they must ritualistically slaughter and offer it to God in the precise manner accorded to each carefully instructed Levitical sacrifice. This means that for the average Israelite, meat was a rarity. And they only got to keep a portion of the animal killed because the remainder was burned up on the altar, and some of what was not burned was given to the priest as their portion. So meat is not something that they were eating all the time because they did have to bring it to give first as a sacrifice, and then there was some food. Now in verse 3, it states that one cannot get around this slaughtering provision simply by removing the animal outside the camp to kill it. This is not something that is only about maintaining a state of purity within Israel. The level of seriousness of this disobedience in God's eyes is detained in verse 4. It states that the blood guilt, shall be imputed to the man who does such a thing as slaughter an animal only for food. This means that the offense is equivalent to murder. Now, when we hear cut off, it means that it is one has rebelled against Jehovah, and as a result, Jehovah's judgment is going to be visited on that person. So they have rebelled, they've gone against the Lord, and now the Lord has said, you will have my wrath, you will have my judgment. Maybe not wrath, but you will have my judgment. Cut off is also meaning cut off from trespassing one of God's commands. Doesn't necessarily occur immediately. So when you are cut off for your trespasses against the Lord, it doesn't always happen immediately. Sometimes it simply means that something is going to happen to you in time as part of God's justice for your rebellion. Now, being cut off generally meant that your life would be cut short. This particular aspect of being cut off was regularly prescribed for the wicked. Being cut off could at times take the form of being expelled from the community of Israel. So excommunicated, so to say. Cut off also carries with it the concept of death at the hands of heaven. This is seen as a divine punishment, and the punishment doesn't necessarily end with the death of the violator, nor even affect him directly. Sometimes it could be passed down and carried down through the descendants, through generation after generation. A child might die as a punishment for it. So being cut off could even mean that one's family line might come to a complete end. And that, in a sense, your lineage would coming to a complete end would pretty much be worse than your own death. Because if you have no descendants, your spirit, it's pretty much You don't continue. Now, we're going to look at Genesis. Now, we're going to think about Genesis 9, where we find Noah is given the okay to kill the creatures for food. So in Genesis 9:1, God tells Noah, hey, Noah, go ahead. All the animals are now going to fear you, and you can eat them. And oh, guess what? They're going to eat each other too. Pretty much that's what it says. So for the first time in history of the world after the flood, Jehovah had given man permission to eat the creatures. Because Genesis 9 verse 5 says, from every beast I will require it. They didn't want to kill and eat Noah or his family, the animals didn't, on the ark. They had no desire for that. But once they were off the ark and God said, you can do that, this is when we see this happening. Now, when we look at the beginning and we see Adam and Eve, and up to Noah and the great flood, animals were not being killed for food. Then the great flood, but animals, presumably clean, domesticated animals, were killed for sacrificing. So there was sacrificing going on, but they were not eating them. And it would seem reasonable that the skins from these animals were for some time used as clothing and perhaps tents and to hold liquids. So pretty much up until the flood, no eating meat, used for sacrifices. Then when we have the flood happen and Noah gets onto dry land, he does make this first sacrifice, and then God says, you can eat meat. And at that time, when God says you can eat the animals, and now the animals are going to try to go after each other, he does not say that you can't, he doesn't put limits on the food. He just says, go ahead and eat them. So it appears that man could have eaten any living creature starting immediately after the great flood. And that was in effect until God gets with Moses at Mount Sinai around 1,200 years or more after the great flood. Then on Mount Sinai, God is giving explicit instructions concerning the eating of the living creatures. And he divides the animals into clean, which is acceptable, and unclean, which is not acceptable foods for men. Now, continuing to look at Genesis 9, verse 4, it did place some rules about using meat for food. It said you cannot in any way, shape, or form have any amount of blood in your food. It has to be completely drained because life is in the blood. So God dedicated blood for the sole purpose of atonement. The pattern was one was not allowed to eat something so sacred as the source of atonement, which is blood. The spiritual purpose for blood was life and atonement. So to use blood for any other purpose was against the Lord's will. Now, going back to Leviticus chapter 17, when we look at verse 4, we're told that all the domestic animals used for food had to be first part of a sacrifice. So if someone broke this law, they had committed blood or blood guilt and were therefore subject to being cut off by God. In verse 5, it makes it clear that this ordinance concerning blood was not a preemptive strike, that the Israelites were currently killing animals from their flocks and herds out in the open fields, thinking that they didn't count. The idea was that they were outside the camp in Israel. God's rules on blood didn't apply. So we have the Israelites kind of doing their own thing, and there's a little blood, it's okay. They're not fully understanding. So the Lord is saying, no, we are going to be doing things this way. There is no more sacrificing out here. out of the camp, because some of the Israelites were going out of the camp and they were doing sacrifices to the other gods. So they probably built a small little altar, offered some of the animals to the gods that they learned about in Egypt, and because they're fully not understanding that there's one true God. It's going to take a long time for Jehovah to get this out of their minds and to make them understand that it is one God. It is Jehovah. And that they have to obey him and him alone. So in the wilderness, Jehovah was in the midst of wringing 400 years of Egypt out of the Israelites. So it's going to take him 40 years in the wilderness for him to feel like, okay, the Israelites might kind of sort of understand that I am their God, that they are not to do sacrifices, they're not to have any blood, they are to follow these rules that I am giving them very, very specifically. When we look at verses 5 through 8, we see that the sacrificial categories is for a precise reason. Each has a precise ritual, and each has a certain occasion upon which it has to be performed. Some of these classes of sacrifice are mandatory. Not all of them are voluntary, and they must be performed when the law says they must, or there is an unpleasant consequence. Others of these sacrificial categories are voluntary, and in general, the worshiper decides for himself when and if they're going to offer it to God. In verse 5, the reference as the type of sacrifice that has to be brought before the Lord is a zavah shalaman. The significance of this is that it is a type of offering that can be brought to the Lord whenever the worshiper decides. So an Israelite who decided it was time for his family to eat meat could go and do the Zavah Shalim, which I want to say it's one of the first three. Do you guys remember which one it was? Zavah Shalim. Shemin. I think it's the peace offering. It's one of the first three offerings. So whenever they wanted to eat meat, they could go and bring that offering to the Lord so that they could be presentable before the Lord. Remember, it's about your sin nature being washed clean. So an Israelite who decided it was time for his family to eat meat could bring a Zavah Shalom offering at his whim and go home from the sanctuary with the remainder of the animal on his shoulders. Further, some of the offerings had to be completely destroyed by fire. In other words, and others portions that weren't burnt up were to go to the priest, so the worshiper did not receive any portion of the animal itself. The Zavah Shalom, however, provided for the bulk of the sacrificial animal to go to the worshiper. So the reason for the Zavah Shalom sacrifices were undoubtedly the most numerous sacrifices performed, because if they wanted to eat meat and it was whenever they wanted, they could bring it. Now, when we look at verse 8, it makes it clear that all these regulations apply to foreigners living among Israelites as well as the natural-born Israelites. So let's make clear that the entire range of sacrifices, every category with no exceptions, must be performed in the tabernacle. Verse 7, the people will no longer offer their sacrifices to the goat demon in the wilderness. So obviously, they're bringing in all these different kind of Egyptian and pagan rituals that they're doing outside the camp. And this is not going to be happening anymore. Now, when we looked at yesterday at Leviticus chapter 16, and we talked about Yom Kippur and the scapegoat ritual, there is a point where the scapegoat is sent out into Azazel. Now, Azazel was also known as a goat demon, is what it was known as. So Azazel and goat demons are thought to be evil powers that ruled the wilderness regions. So further, the scapegoat ritual, when the scapegoat was sent out to Azazel, it was not a sacrifice offering to the goat demons. Instead, it was the opposite. It was the scapegoat was loaded up with all of Israel's sins and uncleanliness and sent back to the evil one. Because remember, the hands get put on the scapegoat, and the scapegoat gets sent out into the wilderness, into Azazel. And that is where it's like the Lord's saying, ha, you can't win. I have all the power over you. Now, when we look at verses 10 through 12, we're going to be told that it's kind of about what we previously talked about. And they're not to partake in any blood, or they're going to be cut off. Verse 13 starts a new instruction, and it involves the killing of non-domestic animals, wild animals. So the first 12 verses of chapter 17 refers to the domestic animals, approved food, and the sacrificial sources. And that is very different than the wild animals that can be used for food, but not for sacrificing. So the ideal is when man is out hunting animals, deer, antelope, and birds, he doesn't have to drive his prey toward the sanctuary. But never can they have the animal's blood just because it's wild. The blood provision applies to all of the meat. The blood of a wild animal is not suitable for sacrifice, so it must be drained from the animal and burned in the ground. The life which is in the blood must be returned to the dust, which is to return to God, and not ever used for food. It is extremely important that blood is never used. Now, in verse 15 and 16, those verses deal with what must have been an everyday matter for the refugees for Egypt, something they would encounter both in the wilderness and after they settled in the promised land. It's not that the person is instructed against eating flesh that was killed in those manners, where they were killed naturally or by another animal. It's just that the person who does eat it becomes unclean. And that uncleanliness lasts until the end of the current day. So from sunset to sunset. And then the person takes a ritual bath and they are clean again. They have to wash their garments as well. Now, it says, if a person takes these steps to become clean again, then all is well. If he does not, then we're told in verse 16 that he shall bear the guilt. He shall bear guilt is if a person chooses to eat the flesh of an animal that has died of natural causes, or for an accidental death, fell off a cliff or something like that, or it was attacked and killed by another animal, then that person has not done something against God. God permits it. However, if that person chooses to do this allowed thing, there is a mild consequence that goes with it, in that he becomes ritually impure for a few hours and must take a ritual bath and must wash clothes. There's no sin or transgression against the Lord, but God really isn't even saying he'd rather you not do it. It's just that choosing to eat the flesh of an animal that died this way, there are conditions. So if you choose those conditions laid out by God, then there is no problem. So if you follow those conditions laid out by God, then there's no problem. But if you don't, now you have transgressed against Jehovah. Not because you ate the meat that was killed in that manner, but because you failed to follow his purification procedures. So to bear guilt means you are guilty of trespassing against Jehovah for failing to follow his procedures. And now there will be judgment of some sort. The exact punishment, if there is any, the time and the place are completely up to Jehovah. He gets to decide. So further, since they now would bear the guilt, they must make an atoning sacrifice, something that would not have been required if they had just followed the purification. So that's Leviticus chapter 17. I do hope that this is helping and not confusing you guys. It's helping me, but I just don't know if I'm relaying it back to you well. But you guys are the salt and the light of the world. Go and be that. And tomorrow I will post Leviticus chapter 18.